There is a lake in New Mexico that is now more than 90% gone. If you stand directly at its receded edge today, you can look out across the horizon and not see a single drop of water. Elephant Butte Reservoir, a basin engineered to be the absolute centerpiece of the entire Rio Grande, sits at an apocalyptic 9.6% full. A reservoir that was once celebrated as the largest man-made lake on the face of the earth, built to hold more than 2 million acre-feet of water, has been reduced to a shrinking brown smear in the desert. The concrete dam holding it back, finished in 1916, stands more than 90 feet above the surface of the water it is supposed to be holding back. It is a monument built for a lake that is no longer there. The federal government is now openly projecting that by late August 2026, this reservoir could fall to just 2% of its total capacity. 2%, that is lower than this vital system has been in over 70 years. The bottom of the lakebed is now completely visible across miles of cracked, sun-baked clay that has not seen a single ray of direct sunlight in over a century. If you walk out onto that exposed floor, the clay is split into deep, jagged plates wide enough to step between, while the old waterline remains stained like a ghost on the rock walls far above your head. Most people looking at this disaster assume a reservoir dries up simply because it stops raining. But that is the comfort of a lie. That is not what is happening here. The mountains that feed the Rio Grande did get snow this winter. The true crisis, the detail that changes absolutely everything about our future, is the terrifying reality of when that water moved. The snow that feeds this lake did not melt slowly into a predictable spring runoff. It melted earlier than any spring on record, peaking and vanishing before the dam's infrastructure could even catch it. The water arrived early, moved too fast, and was gone before anyone could store it. By March 27th, a critical stretch of the Rio Grande near San Acacia went completely dry, marking the earliest that reach has dried out in 30 years. This is how an entire international river system goes bankrupt in real time. The safety net engineered to bank water through a century of drought is empty, and the forces pulling it down are accelerating simultaneously. We are watching the physical mechanics of an environmental collapse that cannot be undone by a single good rainstorm. The conversation behind closed doors has quietly shifted from recovery to survival rationing, and the people who live along its shores are completely powerless to stop it. Here is the part that no one is putting on a tourism postcard. There is a town built directly on the shore of this dying lake. Its local economy, its summer tourism, its identity, and its entire reason to exist are tied completely to the water. And that town is named Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A community literally named after a game show gamble is now standing on the precipice, watching the very resource it bet everything on evaporate into the blistering New Mexico sky. In a normal year, Truth or Consequences thrives on the pulse of the reservoir. The town breathes life when the crowds arrive, filling local businesses, renting boats, and bringing economic stability to the high desert. On a typical holiday weekend, the water is alive with movement. But this year, the illusion has shattered. Over the recent Memorial Day weekend, about 35,000 people came to Elephant Butte. The year before it was around 60,000. The town watched nearly half of its biggest holiday crowd simply not show up because the water wasn't there to greet them. The lake that weekend was hovering at 11%, down from 13% the previous year. Jonathan Horsley, the superintendent of Elephant Butte Lake State Park, put it as plainly as a man can, "We do expect the water to go down. We are an irrigation reservoir." But knowing the numbers doesn't soften the impact on daily life. Only 2 boat ramps across the entire state park were even usable. In the days surrounding that single holiday weekend, desperate park crews had to rescue approximately 20 boats on 20 separate occasions. Visitors had driven out across what looked from a distance like open water, only to run violently aground on treacherous mudflats that used to sit safely under 40 feet of rolling water. The lake is now so shallow, so structurally altered, that the old maps in people's heads no longer match the actual bottom of the basin. The local businesses whose names contain the word lake cannot simply pack up and move. Neil Brown, who owns the marinas at the state park and the historic dam site buildings, watches this retreat daily. His stone cottages, built more than a century ago for the workers who raised the dam, were placed there precisely because they looked out over what was once the largest engineered body of water in the world. Now they look out over a widening, dusty bowl. When the water drops, the boats must be towed out into a narrow channel that shrinks by the week. The docks are forced to chase the receding waterline downhill, leaving a community stranded a quarter-mile away from its own lifeline. To understand why Elephant Butte is bleeding out, you have to look at the three invisible forces pulling the system apart at the exact same time. The first force is the failure of the mountain snowpack timing. This spring, the winter accumulation vanished long before the summer heat even arrived. By the middle of April, the snowpack in the critical Rio Chama Basin was sitting at a miserable 4% of its historic average. The Rio Grande headwaters were at 13% of average, while the Jemez Mountains had already melted out completely. Because the soil was hyper-parched from consecutive dry years, it acted like a sponge, absorbing the rapid runoff before the river could ever carry the bulk of the volume south to the reservoir. The water peaked and vanished before the gates could catch it. The second force is a cruel design flaw of the reservoir itself. A basin like Elephant Butte is not engineered to be deep and narrow. It is wide and shallow, spread incredibly thin across the flat desert floor. A wide, shallow lake sitting directly under the intense New Mexico sun is the most efficient evaporation machine you could possibly design. As the volume drops, a terrifying mathematical reality takes over. The less water there is, the larger the percentage of it that simply lifts into the atmosphere and disappears. The lake is actively losing its resource from the top to the sky, while the river that should be refilling it from the north arrives early and completely empty. The third force is the structural pressure applied by human hands hundreds of miles before the river ever approaches the dam. The Rio Grande does not flow untouched through the state. It is aggressively tapped the entire way down its run. Colorado farmers began diverting heavily from the river in the middle of March. New Mexico agricultural irrigation districts started their pull in late March. By the time the early rapid snowmelt was racing south, the straws were already deep in the river ahead of it. The water that should have built up momentum and pooled behind the concrete dam was being pulled out for fields hundreds of miles upstream before it ever had a chance to arrive at truth or consequences. Early snowmelt, a shallow lake bleeding to the sky, and a river systematically drained from above, all three forces hit their worst metrics simultaneously this year, leaving the reservoir completely defenseless. The structural baseline for this crisis isn't a comparison to a bad recent season. It requires looking back 70 years to the absolute worst period anyone alive can remember. The last time Elephant Butte Reservoir dropped this low was in 1954, during the depths of one of the most punishing, historic multi-year droughts in New Mexico's recorded history. Back then, the active storage in the basin bottomed out near 13,000 acre-feet. The federal projections for this August would put the region right back within reach of that historic, terrifying floor. But 70 years ago, the surrounding world looked completely different. The demands on the system were a fraction of what they are today. When the dam was completed in 1916, it was heralded as an international triumph of water engineering. The entire concept of the Rio Grande project was to build a system specifically designed to survive prolonged drought. It was engineered to act as a massive societal safety net, banking immense surpluses during rare wet years and methodically releasing those reserves during the dry cycles so that the agricultural valleys and growing communities downstream would never have to go thirsty. It was a promise written in concrete and steel. Yet, even during the mid-century crisis, early water managers caught a glimpse of the system's inherent vulnerability. They observed how quickly the wide, shallow layout of the lake surrendered its volume to the desert air during consecutive high-heat summers. The historical data from the 1950s showed that when inflow dropped below critical thresholds, the reservoir's evaporation rates began to outpace the actual amount of water being delivered to human hands. It was a clear, empirical warning that the safety net had a physical limit, that the desert would always demand its share first. But because the system eventually recharged during the exceptionally wet decades of the late 1970s and 1980s, those early warning signs were treated as a once-in-a-century anomaly rather than a fundamental flaw in long-term planning. The structural warning was filed away, urban and agricultural expansion continued under the assumption of permanent abundance, and the safety net was left exposed to the next major shift in climate reality. The physical reality of what happens when that safety net fails is unfolding right now, measured in the staggering loss of volume over the last 12 months alone. 1 year ago, Elephant Butte Reservoir was sitting at 11.9% full. In just 12 short months, it has shed almost 45,000 acre-feet of water. Today, the system is entering its third consecutive year of critically low flows. Carolyn Donnelly, the water operations supervisor for the Bureau of Reclamation in Albuquerque, the federal agency tasked with running this massive dam, is direct about the gravity of the situation. Her words lay bare the compounding nature of the crisis. We're going into our third year of very low flows, at least in the northern part of the state. 3 dry years in a row, 2024, 2025, and now 2026. When asked by investigators exactly how low the system could drop by the end of the season, her projection was unflinching. The prediction of 2% by August is what we're predicting based on a poor monsoon season. This is the disaster following the warning. In a normal climate regime, a series of bad years could theoretically be erased by one exceptional winter snowpack or one powerful, sustained summer monsoon season. But the federal experts are being blunt about why that traditional recovery model is officially broken. There is no additional reservoir storage upstream to act as a buffer. There is no hidden backup tank for water managers to draw from to stabilize the system. The water that has left the basin is permanently gone, and the ground temperature is now so consistently high that any incoming moisture is instantly compromised. The true disaster isn't just that the lake is disappearing. It is that the drop is accelerating the structural degradation of the entire region's economy. When 45,000 acre-feet of water vanishes from a shallow basin in a single year, it completely alters the temperature and salinity of the remaining pool. The water becomes heavier, more concentrated with minerals, and far more difficult to treat or utilize. The visual of empty boat ramps and stranded marinas is just the surface level of the catastrophe. Underneath the sun-baked clay lies the reality that the primary water bank for southern New Mexico has spent its capital, and the environmental ledger is completely out of balance with no federal intervention capable of manufacturing a solution. But even as the reservoir empties into the sky, here is the structural break that stops people cold. The dam cannot simply close its gates, hold onto the remaining 9.6% of the water, and wait for a better year. The valves are running wide open right now. Over a single recent holiday weekend, telemetry gauges revealed that roughly 750 cubic feet per second of water were actively leaving the dam, while a miserable, nominal 50 cubic feet per second were flowing into the lake from the north. The infrastructure was discharging 15 times more water than it was receiving. Why would water managers willingly bleed a dying reservoir dry? Because that water is not legally theirs to keep. Every drop of it is already owed to entities hundreds of miles away under legal agreements written over a century ago. Downstream of this empty lake sit the sprawling commercial farms of southern New Mexico, the entire municipal infrastructure of the city of Las Cruces, and across the state line, El Paso, Texas, a massive metropolitan area of nearly 700,000 people that depends heavily on drinking water pulled directly from this river every single summer. And the legal obligations do not stop at the state line or the international border. Under a solemn international treaty signed between the United States and Mexico in 1906, the federal government is legally obligated to deliver exactly 60,000 acre-feet of Rio Grande water every single year to Mexico, terminating at the canal directly above Ciudad Juarez. A river that can no longer physically fill its own reservoir is still bound by a 120-year-old international obligation to keep running into another country. The men who authored the 1906 convention actually anticipated this exact nightmare. Buried deep within the text of the treaty is a specific clause stating that in the event of an extraordinary drought, the water deliveries to Mexico will be cut in the exact same proportion as the water cuts imposed on American farms below the dam. The legal machinery to ration an entire international river was written into the framework before the concrete at Elephant Butte was even poured. The architects of the project always knew that the day would arrive when there simply wouldn't be enough water to go around. That day has officially arrived, and the water being systematically drained from the reservoir doesn't even make it straight downstream. It has to be caught miles south in a smaller regulating basin called Caballo Reservoir, a desperate, rapid relay handoff of a resource that is completely flatlining at both ends of the pipe. The most immediate and brutal consequence of this legal relay handoff is felt by the farmers who live right beside the waterline. The Elephant Butte Irrigation District is responsible for delivering critical water allocations to more than 90,000 acres of prime New Mexico farmland, much of it centered around the town of Hatch, the self-proclaimed chili capital of the world. In a standard, hydrologically healthy year, a farmer in this valley can expect a full contractual allotment of around 3 feet of water spread across every single acre of their land. This year, because the reservoir has collapsed, that allotment has completely imploded to roughly 4 inches. 4 inches? For a professional chili or pecan farmer, that single number represents the absolute line between a profitable harvest and a total dust field. And here is the sheer cruelty of the situation. The water leaving the dam at 750 cubic feet per second is flowing directly past those parched, drying fields, completely out of reach of the local families who can see the reservoir from their front porches. The gates run wide open to satisfy downstream municipal and international obligations that do not pause for a local dry year, while the regional agricultural community is strictly rationed to a fraction of its survival layout. Gary Essinger, who has managed the Elephant Butte Irrigation District for more than 3 decades, has spent his entire career watching the district swing between full allotments and lean years. But he knows that 4 inches across 90,000 acres isn't just a lean year, it is a brutal triage decision. A chili plant in the Hatch Valley requires steady, predictable moisture throughout the intense heat of a New Mexico summer to properly set its fruit. When you cut that supply to a mere fraction, the farmer is faced with a series of choices that no spreadsheet can ever make easy. They must either choose to plant only a tiny fraction of their acreage and let the rest of their land go completely fallow, or they must invest thousands of dollars to drill deep groundwater wells. Pumping groundwater not only skyrockets their operational costs due to energy demands, but it actively pulls down the regional water table, increasing the salinity of the soil. The final, most devastating option is to simply skip the season entirely, letting fields turn to dust. When you multiply that agonizing calculation across thousands of individual multigenerational farms, an entire agricultural empire built over a century begins to contract and disintegrate in a single dry year. The institutional framework surrounding the Rio Grande is now openly bracing for this degradation to become the permanent baseline, rather than a temporary emergency. In May of this year, the United States Supreme Court officially approved a long-fought, fiercely contested legal settlement over the management of the river, accepting the formal recommendation of a special master and ending a bitter legal battle between New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado that had dragged on for more than a decade. The explicit terms of this historic settlement tell you everything you need to know about where our water future is headed. Under the newly approved mandate, the state of New Mexico is now legally required to permanently cut its groundwater pumping along the river corridor by 18,200 acre-feet every single year within the next decade. State officials have already admitted behind closed doors that the single easiest, most direct way to hit that aggressive federal target is to systematically buy up historic farm water rights and permanently retire the agricultural land. Let that reality sink in completely. The official, long-term legal plan to save the river involves permanently destroying the farming communities that built the region. The very same farms around Hatch and Las Cruces that are already dealing with a miserable 4-inch water allotment this year are the ones targeted for permanent elimination. The visible drought on the surface is merely the symptom. Underneath it is a slow, irreversible legal reckoning over who gets to keep farming in the American desert at all, and agriculture is losing the fight. As the agricultural sector contracts, the crisis immediately cascades into the major urban centers downstream. The cities of Las Cruces and El Paso, representing nearly 1 million combined residents, are being forced to lean with immense force on their underground aquifers because the surface river they share is running thin. El Paso has already been forced to initiate its emergency summer switch, utilizing specialized, high-cost desalination and treatment facilities to specifically process Rio Grande water in an effort to spare its rapidly depleting groundwater reserves. But it is a self-defeating cycle. The drier the river becomes, the harder these desert municipalities are forced to pump the ground the rest of the year to sustain basic daily life. Every single foot that Elephant Butte Reservoir drops pushes a major American city deeper into the earth for water it can no longer pull from the surface. John Irizarry, the acting area manager for the Bureau of Reclamation in Albuquerque, framed the entire modern operational challenge in a single, sobering sentence. Being faced with a third dry year in a row is a big challenge. I am confident our team will work closely with all stakeholders to make the available water supply stretch as far as possible. Listen carefully to what that bureaucratic language is actually telling us. The strategic goal of the United States government is no longer to fill the reservoir, nor is it to restore the historic flow of the river. The goal is simply to manage the decline, to stretch the final, remaining drops of a vanishing resource as far as the law will allow before the system hits absolute zero. Consider the numbers stacked end to end: a reservoir sitting at 9.6% capacity, a waterline hovering 94 feet below where it was engineered to sit, a projected drop to 2% by the end of August, and an agricultural allotment slashed from 36 inches down to 4. 60,000 acre-feet of water are still legally owed across an international border from a basin that lost 45,000 acre-feet in a single 12-month stretch. This leads to the ultimate question that the residents of Truth or Consequences and the wider Rio Grande Valley are living with every single day. What does a lake town do when the lake leaves first? If the largest reservoir in the state can be drawn down to nothing in a single dry stretch, what exactly is holding up the rest of the American Southwest? Please share this video immediately with anyone you know living in the Southwest. We must expose the true reality of this water crisis before the taps go silent. Subscribe to this channel right now to get our exclusive, forensic breakdowns on the hidden environmental disasters that are actively reshaping our world. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we investigate a massive western aquifer currently being pumped to its absolute limit.